Hey there, my name's Max. I'm an independent game developer working on my debut game, Night Shift Galaxy, which is kind of like an anime style mecha robot combat game. And I just wanted to do like a little process video on like how I'm making and adding like robots to the game. So here's a character that I sort of finished up this week. This is kind of like a walking gun. And I thought I'd just like walk you through from like concept to execution, like how you get to this point, since this was totally made from scratch. Um, I am like a solo developer on this project. I'm not working with a team, so my process is like a little bit different than like AAA professional people. For starters, I like put a lot of priority on like reusable assets, so like stuff that I can copy paste around a lot. I try and think of stuff as being like built like modular out of like these kind of like canisters and screws and plates, so that I can just like really quickly remix stuff. And I also have a kind of like 90% is good enough rule. Like I can't really like spend a lot of time on this stuff. And like often like the last 10% of polish is like the majority of the work. So if I can figure out like, you know, sort of a process that gets me most of the way there, I just call it good enough and move on to the next thing. I don't like really rat hole on making stuff like perfect, like how I see it in my head. Um, so the process here started in Fire Alpaca, which is kind of like a free program you can download that's made for comic book artists. I like it for sketching and stuff. So you can see I spent a while just sort of like sketching out different ideas of like sort of forward bending legs and backward bending legs, and should it be on 4 legs or 2 legs, and should it be a kind of like tripod situation or like a kind of like quadruped situation. I came down to this like chicken walker idea that I liked, which kind of looks like the Regal battle pods from Macross, which is pretty nice. I try and like put in some like little references into the game for people who are into all that kind of like 80s anime stuff. So yeah, this was my original concept art that I worked off of, and then I went into another free program called Blender and I modeled it. This modeling took about 2 or 3 hours. Wasn't that bad. As you can see, it's like pretty low poly. Like those screws are just like 8 faces. Um, I've done a little bit of practice. It's not like this is my first model, so you definitely get faster at it over time, but I really like keeping it as like low geometry as possible, just because it's easier to like think about and work with, right? Like it's not really a performance concern because graphics cards are so insane. I could have a million polygons in here and it would probably be fine. But those are so annoying to work with, whereas like low poly stuff, it's like very easy to get it in like just the right shape. So I actually am pretty new to Blender. I've like spent 2 decades using Maya, which is like an expensive program they pay a few $100 a year for as an indie to license. And I've been just generally speaking trying to get away from subscription-based software towards either like open source software or stuff that I can pay once. So, you know, less Autodesk stuff like Maya and ZBrush, using Blender instead. I'm not really using like Photoshop or Illustrator anymore. There's like another set of programs called Affinity which do that. So I've been using that for all the graphic design stuff. So I'm still learning. I watched probably 24 YouTube tutorials while I was going, so that's just part of the process. Now, a lot of the quality doesn't actually come from the geometry, it comes from the shading. So here's my material graph. It might look a little complicated, but I promise you it's not. These are basically just like a bunch of sources of images that are being blended together to make this final guy, and I can step through all of them and how and why I set them up the way I did. So the first thing is there's like a base color, and the way that I do this is actually by adding a second UV map to my model, which I can use to index into a texture, which is just a color palette, right? So I just select all the faces I want to be yellow, and I shrink them down, and I put them all over this like yellow part of the texture. So I can actually like grab this, I can move it over here, now all the yellow parts are white. So that makes it really easy to reconfigure the colors. Like it makes the color information like really easy to work with, even if I'm like editing the mesh and changing topology, I'm not ruining the colors. I can like edit this texture map to like totally recolor the guy here, since like it's basically like palletized. And like even if I, be, even if I like change the topology a lot and have to change like the main like UV unwrap, that doesn't invalidate this like secondary UV set, which is just like palette things and isn't related to the geometry at all. So going back to shading, in addition to having color channels, I also have the second PBR map that's using the same like UV map. PBR stands for physically based rendering, and this is like basically how the like sort of render engines for most like modern like game engines work now, which is that in addition to the regular color channels, red, green, blue, and alpha, you now have like 3 additional channels, which is roughness, which tells you basically if you're matte like a piece of chalk, or if you're glossy like a piece of polished plastic or like a polished and waxed car. You have metalness, which tells you if you are just like a pure color or if you're reflective at all. And then there's emissive, which is like if you glow in the dark, and how much light you're emitting. So I pack those into the RGB of a second texture. So red, that means rough, that means this part's matte, and this part's like a little bit shinier. Green, I map to metalness, so you see this, all these parts are totally non-metallic, whereas these parts are like 50% metallic basically. And then blue is for emission, but I don't actually have any emissive surfaces on this. But if there were like headlights or whatever, right, I would like color them blue and then they would be glowing. So then in addition to that base palette, I then have some painted details. And these are actually on the main like UV unwrap. And like, by the way, this unwrap, I just use Blender's like automatic unwrap, which is kind of crappy. It doesn't saturate the space. It leaves all these like empty things here. It doesn't align them nicely. Sometimes things are like crooked, and so like their samples are going to be like kind of diagonal. But it got me 90% of the way there. And that's my principle, is that like I would rather get it like good enough rather than getting it perfect. So yeah, I just automatically unwrapped it in my like main UV map and then just painted directly on there. So like obviously if I changed up the geometry here, if I did edits, if I like added a bunch of stuff or whatever and had to unwrap it again, it would junk all of this. But I kind of feel like if I was editing this, I would want to repaint it anyway. So like I'm not too worried about that. And there's like not that much. I could like repaint this in like 15 minutes. So that goes through a mix node where you see I just alpha composite the two, right? So now I have all my base color layers. And then those colors are passed through an adjustment layer, which adds all of this extra like texturing and stuff. So all this texturing is provided by a bunch of procedural texture nodes that I get from a add-on that I got from the Blender Marketplace called Materializer, which is, it's maintained by like basically one handsome French dude, and it's $30, and it gives you like kind of like a scrappy indie good enough approximation of what Adobe Substance does, but doesn't cost you $250 a year like Adobe Substance does. So just to like break down everything that I'm doing here, you can see I start with like generating some scratches. So you can see where it's black, that's just like 0% scratches, and white is like 100% scratches. And then I add into that this like edge wear, which is basically like, if there's ever like a sharp angle or whatever, that's kind of exposed to the elements, and so it should be sort of worn out a little bit. Next, I have these streaks, which kind of look like water damage, like it's been kept in a warehouse that doesn't have a dehumidifier. And so those get added with all of the previous effects and then pass through this hue saturation value adjustment, right? And so we get it like a little bit darker in where those masks were 100%. So yeah, that basically does it for all the colors. And then the last important thing that the material is doing is generating a normal map. So normals are like which direction all the surfaces are facing, and that affects basically like like light, right? Like you can see light's coming in from my right hand side, so any parts of my face that are pointed to the right, they're illuminated, and if you're pointed to the left, you're not illuminated. And by default, things are just oriented the way their geometry is oriented, but you can actually have a map to adjust it internally. So the first thing that I do is I pass it through a bevel node, and what this does is, you see it kind of like fills in all these interfaces and it rounds out all these outer faces. So it's not actually adding any geometry. Like if I really zoomed in, you can see this is still very low poly, but once you zoom out, once you're not seeing all those little corners and notches and stuff, it makes it look like this was like actually smoothed out and has like way more geometry than it really has, which is also quite nice for not seeing any like rough, hard, aliased, like transitions between two lit surfaces. It's always going to have like a nice smooth transition. Now this like is like kind of annoying because it just affects all edges equally. So you can see I put like a 30 centimeter bevel on like basically everything. So like, oh, it's kind of like blurring this and it's kind of blurring this, and then, you know, so I'm getting it some places I like it, but I'm also getting some places I maybe wouldn't like it. The way that you would do that, like for realsies in a real game, is you would use you would either like model a higher resolution version of this, or you would go into like a multi-resolution sculpting tool like ZBrush and just like sculpt out which edges are beveled and how much they're beveled, and is it a smooth bevel, or if you wanted like maybe to make this kind of like jaggedy and irregular to simulate like a welding like sort of bead, like you could do all kinds of stuff like that. But that's really like kind of labor intensive. I mean, you can do it in like Blender has a sort of like poor man ZBrush, and there's a multi-resolution modifier that you can add to objects for doing that. But it's like pretty labor intensive. It adds this like baking step where you have to project the sculpt back into like a normal map on the low poly, which is just like adding more time and steps to the process, which like I gotta do dozens of these guys, and so like any steps that I can get rid of. And so, you know, like I said, I'm always looking for ways to be like good enough rather than perfect, and this is good enough, so that's what I'm going with. I pass that through the same scratches node that's generating the scratch mask. It also generates scratch normals, right? So you can see we've kind of scratched up the actual sort of like direction of the surface. That also gets passed then through the like water damage grunge, which gives it this like irregular surface. I don't know if this is really coming through in the video, but like it's not like a perfectly smooth surface anymore. It's got like sort of like irregularity, right, due to the water damage, you know, maybe kind of like the texture of like, you know, rusty metal. And then finally, I pass that through a bump map in which I've painted like additional etchings. So just to look at that, you can see the etching map is just a black and white image. Once again, I just painted that here directly in Blender. And then, you know, pass that through a bump and just set the distance to -1, and that makes it go in rather than pop out. So that gives me all of this extra detailing. So all of this stuff goes into like Blender's BSDF node, which combines it and like renders it like a physical surface. So this all looks good in Blender, but you can see as I'm like moving it around, it like drops to like low quality while I'm dragging, and then it like progressively improves it when I let go. That's because this is a software renderer. This isn't like a thing that a graphics card can do in real time. So in order to import it into the game engine, we have to like pre-render this result. Luckily, Materializer, the same plugin that was generating all these noise textures, and has a bunch of other features I haven't started using yet, like mix layers. But it has a built-in PBR baking tool, which will generate texture images, right? Like I'm generating 2K textures of all this stuff that we are generating procedurally here. So if I go back into the engine, you can see I've got a color map, I've got a metallic map, I've got a normal map, and I've got a roughness map. So here's the color map, and you can see that has everything I painted. It has my palettes, it has all of the like noise and stuff, just like sort of automatically like pre-rendered and filled in so that the graphics card can just sample it. Here is the metal map. This is basically just masking like all the parts that are metallic. And these are like gray rather than white because they're not perfectly reflective, right? They're not like silver mirrors. They're kind of like grungy. Here's the normal map. Normal maps, like if they're tangent-based normal maps, which is like the default that everybody uses now, that means they're like relative to the true normal. So like blue is like an unmodified normal, and then like kind of greenish or pinkish represents when it's being deflected up, down, left, right. So you can see it's getting like deflected on the edges to do those bevels. It has all of the engravings that I painted, and also if we really zoom in, you can see all the scratches and the water damage. And then the last one here, this is the roughness map. So anything that's white is going to be matte, you know, like a piece of chalk. Anything that's black is going to be totally glossy, right, like a freshly waxed car. So, you know, I have some areas here which are like mostly but not perfectly matte, and then some other areas here which are like maybe 50% glossy. Like I don't have anything that's like super shiny because this is kind of like a dingy mech. So yeah, you pop all that together like in Unreal, which just has like standard PBR ports for all those maps in its like material editor. And then I also added like a little bit of this like sort of yellow Fresnel to make the character really pop against the background, because you can see like especially all the other pirate stuff has like the same color, so I want to like differentiate the environment from the characters. And then in this scene I've also got like a pink bounce light coming up from the ground, basically just to make this look a little more sort of like stylized and synthwave. And that's a robot. You can like jump around, like shoot it and stuff. It's currently just standing still because I haven't rigged it, which is the process of basically creating a skeleton and then binding all of the different parts of this to the different parts of the skeleton so that it can be posed. And at that point, normally you'd hand it off to an animator, whereas I use programming to completely generate all the animations at runtime, because that's the one thing I am a subject matter expert on. So that's the place where I try and like focus my skills. So that's what I'm going to do next. Basically, as soon as I'm done cutting and posting this video, I'm going to jump into that. I expect that'll probably take like 2 or 3 hours. I'll like work out some kinks. I'll bring it in here, and then I'll start programming, like actually doing the walking animations. So I don't know if I'll finish that tomorrow or if I'll be working on that on Friday's regular live stream, but it is pretty interesting. All the characters I've had so far, you can see, like if you look at Kit's like rabbit mech here, it's just got like dippy toe feet because I didn't want to think about like heel toe animation. But I did specifically add like a heel toe joint onto these mechs, specifically to give me an excuse to start writing that code. So that's the next like big programming task that I'm going to do. Then we'll have these guys walking around and shooting us. So hopefully this was helpful. You know, I'm still learning too. If there's like any advice that anybody has on a better way that I could be doing this stuff faster, like definitely let me know in the comments. Also, if you have any questions or like further elaboration about anything I talked about, you can join the Discord and you can just ask on the AMA channel. And yeah, thanks for watching. Bye.